Hi, I'm Vooght, author of The Spirit in the Sky, Ancient Cosmological Gods, and Where in the World We Find Them. We confidently, if not somewhat arrogantly, assume ourselves the very apex of sophisticated and technological evolution. But what if we're not the greatest after all? Albert Einstein once famously quipped, "The ancients knew something which we seem to have forgotten." I contend that a Graham Hancock-esque pre-Diluvian lost civilization may have essentially hidden some of these answers for us in plain sight. That they've inserted a scientifically viable methodology into the very fabric of their mythologies and chiseled them into stone for the benefit of future generations of the human narrative. And by way of pre-Diluvian, I mean pre-flood. And we're all familiar with the tales of global flood myths, which now appear, excuse the pun, to hold a lot of water. We also understand and accept that global sea levels rose exponentially at the end of the last mini-ice age, around 11,500 years ago. It's a scientific anomaly which rather curiously reflects Plato's tale of a sophisticated society otherwise lost to the current chronology of human civilization. Maybe Plato was right all along. Documented history, that is the earliest chronologies of civilized society being that of the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia and their early dynastic Egyptian counterparts, are historically dated as emerging separate of one another sometime around 3100 BC. It wasn't until the somewhat meteoric and unexplained rise, and then the peculiarly sudden and almost illogical decline regarding technological know-how, that a writing system was first introduced around 3100 BC. Here then, around 3100 BC, we can effectively state that we have a starting point as fixed position of reference some 5,000 years or so ago. Yet we still find ourselves closer to the reign of Cleopatra today than Cleopatra would have been to the currently accepted timeline of the construction of the Great Pyramid. Consider, if you will, what if I told you documented history is only 50 or so lifetimes long? What do I mean by this? Well, an average human life expectancy living in the modern era is around 72 years or so, and it's not uncommon to exceed 100. With this in mind, if we endeavoured to measure recorded history against the life cycles of human beings, equated to that of 100 years, and each lifetime was in fact lived out back to back, that is to say, a person is born, lives 100 years, dies, and another is born and the cycle thus repeated, from our starting point of reference, 3100 BC to the present day, we find that our documented human story is a fascinatingly mere 51 lifetimes long. Think about that for a moment. We can revise this a little if you like, and state our starting reference points are around the time of Christ. Guess what? 21 lifetimes long. Crazy, right? Well, independent geologist and researcher Randall Carlson suggests the following analogy. If we equate the timeline to modern anatomical human beings of 180,000 years and documented history of, say, the last 5,000 years, and create a hypothetical yardstick from which to measure, what becomes glaringly apparent is that for every inch of our 36-inch yardstick is the equivalent of 5,000 years, only one of which accounts for the entire catalogue of recorded human history. Where's the rest of it? To consider we've put a man on the moon, created telecommunication systems that enable us to converse with each other from some of the remotest and inaccessible parts of the globe at the touch of a button, yet a mere 150 years or so ago we were still sitting by candlelight before the advent of electricity, is absolute madness. To simply refute the accomplishments and technological strides to which we find ourselves accredited today, the modern era, could never have played out in some capacity before the documentation of the historic record around 5,000 years ago, and that prehistory, or rather 175,000 years of undocumented prehistory, modern man basically accomplished nothing other than cave art, is an absurdity in the extreme. Furthermore, due to a catalogue of new discoveries, Carlson's hypothetical yardstick has since doubled. There is clearly something inherently wrong. We all feel it. The feeling that something's missing. Enter Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is a cosmologically aligned temple construction which is dated to around 8000 BC. It appears to symbolically suggest that the end of the last mini-ice age, or Younger Dryas period, was due, in part, to a celestial bombardment of the North American ice cap. Modern-day geological evidence suggests that the 13-mile wide diameter Hiawatha crater in Greenland somewhat pinpoints the impact zone described by the high-relief pillar carvings found at Göbekli Tepe. The site still remains only 5% excavated, and Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey means pot-bellied hill, but it also has a far more archaic name, Port Asar, which translates as the umbilical of Osiris, Osiris being the ancient Egyptian deity of resurrection. The significance of the ancient Egyptian god of resurrection, Osiris, is revealed to us by a mythology which would appear to reveal a rather profound insight into the curious riddle that is human consciousness, and is also the earliest reference to the mythological tree of life. The tale of Osiris begins during an elaborate banquet where the guests had been invited by Seth, or Set depending upon your sources, who was Osiris's wicked brother, to each lay down inside a beautifully ornate coffer, and suggested whoever befitted it comfortably could indeed keep it. Guest after guest tried the magnificent coffer, each struggling with its dimensions, either coming up too short or too tall, until the turn of Osiris. Osiris duly laid down inside to find that it fit him perfectly. Yet to the guest's stunned amazement, Seth and his men seized the opportunity and swiftly fastened the coffer with Osiris inside before tossing it into the River Nile. The coffer eventually ran upon the coastal banks of Byblos in modern-day Lebanon, where Osiris became further entombed within the trunk of a resplendent tamarisk tree. After a number of years, the king of Byblos ordered the felling of the tree, as it was to be carved into a pillar which would adorn his halls of his palace. After years of searching, Osiris' sister and wife, Isis, learned of her lover's fate and bargained with the king, who duly agreed to release Osiris from his untimely grave. Seth, however, was enraged by this and dismembered Osiris further, thus dispatching his brother once and for all. Legend further dictates that Osiris became symbolically associated with the constellation of Orion, a celestial god of resurrection. Classically speaking, Egyptologists remain steadfast that this was in fact the case. Osiris was murdered, rescued from inside a tree, before becoming symbolically associated with the constellation of Orion, which again is an absurdity in the extreme. We know this because of the nature of myths are wholly allegorical. So what could this really mean? Well, the myth of Osiris verifies that because Osiris was entombed within the confines of a tamarisk, which is an acacia variety found in abundance on the banks of the River Nile, that he would always be remembered as the so-called lifeblood of the acacia. And here's where it really starts to become interesting. Within the sap or lifeblood of the acacia, we find extractable potentials of DMT, an entheogenic chemical compound which permeates the natural world and is also found in the human body. Terence McKenna describes DMT as a reliable method for crossing into a dimension that human beings have debated the existence of for 50,000 years. An invisible nearby world inhabited by active intelligences which human beings can communicate with. Furthermore, McKenna once described DMT as a reality switch, whereby the practitioner or breakthrough psychonaut will become somewhat privy to an otherwise invisible mindscape which exists around us but deemed otherwise unobservable within the scope of the visual spectrum. Could this otherworldly experience then be likened to the ancient Egyptian duat or underworld, which they describe as being inhabited by gods and entities? Almost certainly. The commonalities are there for all to see. The ancient Egyptian Book of Two Ways describes the soul's journey through a number of otherworldly gateways which are classically guarded by spirits and entities which appear to hold a lot in common with the so-called DMT breakthrough experience. The DMT experience is often spoke of in terms of ego dissolution, whereby the practitioner would classically be subjected to a mini-death. For all intended purposes, this whistle-stop tour of the cosmos sees us becoming gods, and given the keys to understanding the nature of our own temporal existence, all before realizing a reality-shattering and spiritual resurrection. And furthermore, a basic two-dimensional rendering of the molecular structure of this otherworldly psychedelic shares an inexplicable number of commonalities with the constellation of Orion. Osiris in the sky. albeit as above, so below. Once again, I'm Vooght, and The Spirit in the Sky is available via Amazon. You can follow my continued research on all media platforms via @VootRN. Thank you for listening. That's the spirit.